Welcome to the latest episode of Eternal Format 101. This is episode 3. I highly recommend, if you have not already seen episodes 1 and 2, you should go back and watch those. But this is episode 3. Today is a bit of a simpler video, but I think it's an important one still to identify. Today we're going to talk about cards with restrictions. So a lot of the times when we're playing the Pokemon trading card game, we're just familiar with the different types of cards, and so we know what kinds of limitations come with each type of mechanic. However, if you haven't been around for the entirety of the Pokemon trading card game's history, you may not be familiar with all the different cards and their different limitations. So we're going to kind of pass through each of them today and then look at some limitations that are specifically imposed by the Eternal format itself. So up first, let's talk about what I mean by restrictions. So this basically means that for some reason or another, the normal rule of 4 does not apply to that card or that card type. So for most cards in the Pokemon trading card game, we follow that rule of 4, which means we're allowed to have 4 copies of that card by name. One of the most notable exceptions to this rule is the rule for basic energy, which says we can have up to 59 copies of that card, because of course our decks do have to have a basic Pokemon in them that we can start. The rule of 4 is what we normally follow. This is also by name. So what the heck constitutes a name? This is something that trips a lot of people up. So I'm going to read this out loud verbatim. This is directly out of the rulebook. You can see this on page 21 in the official rulebook. It says, what does and doesn't count for a Pokemon's name? Some Pokemon cards have extra information after their name, such as a level or symbol like GL. That's Gym Leader, if you're not familiar. A Pokemon's name changes how you can evolve or play certain cards. Level is not part of a Pokemon's name. Gengar, Gengar level 43, Gengar level 44, and Gengar level X all have the same name. Symbols at the end of a Pokemon's name are part of a Pokemon's name. So Alakazam, Alakazam E4, and Alakazam Star all have different names from each other. However, the Delta symbol, Delta species, is not part of a Pokemon's name. So Aerodactyl and Aerodactyl Delta or Aerodactyl Delta species do in fact have the same name. An owner or form name in a Pokemon's name is part of the Pokemon's name. So Meowth, Alolan Meowth, and Rocket's Meowth all have different names. When you are building a deck, you can only have 4 copies of a card with the same name in it, except for basic energy cards. If your deck has one of each Gengar, Gengar level 43, Gengar level 44, and Gengar level X, you can't put any more cards named Gengar in your deck. However, you could have 4 Meowth, 4 Alolan Meowth, and 4 Rocket's Meowth. When evolving, the evolves from Pokemon name must match the Pokemon being evolved. So Graveler can evolve from Geodude, or Geodude level 12, but not Brock's Geodude. So this is that rule of 4. This is a Pokemon name here in a nutshell, right? This helps us understand the basics. So one of the mechanics that was brought up in this thing is Pokemon level X. So let's look at Pokemon level X. Here we have 2 great examples. This is Giratina level X and Torterra level X. Both of these cards have seen play in the Eternal format. So these are both level ups from Giratina and Torterra, right? But it's something to be aware of when you're building your deck. Level X is not part of the Pokemon's name. So because of that, when you are building a deck that happens to include a level X, you also have to understand that you're taking up the same number of slots, or you're taking up slots rather, that could go to your non-level X counterpart. So if you have 2 copies of Giratina level X in your deck, you now can't have any more than 2 copies of Giratina in your deck, because by the rule of Pokemon names, both of these Pokemon have the name Giratina. The same would go for Torterra, right? You could have 2 copies of Torterra, but you'd be limited to 2 copies of Torterra level X. Or you could have 3 copies of Torterra, but then you would be limited to 1 copy of Torterra level X. Similarly, if you had 4 copies of Giratina, you could no longer put Giratina level X in your deck because you already have 4 Pokemon called Giratina. Now, most cards with noteworthy restrictions are not based on a card's name. Let's look at some mechanic-based restrictions. These are cards that have existed for forever in most cases, or in some cases are more recent. But these are all different sorts of mechanics that have restricted how you can play with individual cards. So up first, we're going to look at Pokemon Star and Radiant Pokemon. So Pokemon Star and Radiant Pokemon are basically the same mechanic. In both cases, you can only have one of any of these specific mechanics in your deck. So for example, for Pokemon Star, you could have exactly 1 Pokemon Star in your deck and no more. So if you had Alakazam Star in your deck, you could not also have Pikachu Star in your deck. You had to choose one or the other. You could not have both. Similarly, Radiant Pokemon work the same way, right? You could have Radiant Alakazam in your deck, but if you did, you could not play Radiant Charizard, for example. You have to pick one or the other. And this mechanic is fairly familiar, I think, to most of us, at least the Radiant mechanic is. And Pokemon Star work exactly the same way, right? This Radiant mechanic is very much a direct copy of the Star mechanic from way back in the day. So we're familiar with it. And because they came back recently in the trading card game, we're also familiar with A-Specs, right? A-Specs are very much the same thing in that they are just like Pokemon Star or just like Radiant Pokemon, in that you can only have exactly one of any one of these particular cards in your deck. So if you had Computer Search in your deck, for example, you cannot then play Master Ball. And if you have Master Ball in your deck, you cannot play Legacy Energy. You have to pick exactly one of those cards and no more. You have to have just one A-Spec. Now, something to be aware of for all three of these mechanics are all very similar to one another, but they are separate mechanics. So you could have a Radiant Alakazam and an Alakazam Star, but you could also have a Computer Search. These are all separate mechanics. So as long as you're obeying each individual mechanic's rule, you can still have however many that mechanic is allowing you to have. In each case here, it's one. So you could have the one A-Spec, Computer Search, the one Pokemon Star, Alakazam Star, and the one Radiant Pokemon Alakazam, the Radiant Alakazam rather. Now, these cards have existed before, and as you can see by that lovely little transformation animation, Computer Search and Master Ball have both existed as not A-Spec cards. Now, there is a fun little rule that exists for the Eternal and Unlimited formats. Eternal, of course, is a modification of the Unlimited format, so it borrows the rule directly, that says these two cards here, so these older prints of Master Ball and Computer Search, and the other prints that look just like these, can be used in place of their A-Spec counterparts. So this base set Computer Search for the Eternal format and for Unlimited format can be used in place of the A-Spec. So if you don't have a Boundaries Crossed A-Spec Computer Search, that's fine. In the Eternal format, you can use this Computer Search from base set, and that's A-okay. Same goes with this Master Ball from Gym Challenge. You could play it as a Master Ball from the more recent sets, for example. Now, this does not apply to Expanded, so if you're trying to play the Expanded format, this rule does not apply for Expanded. You do have to use the more recent A-Spec prints of those cards. It's also worth noting too that if you are going to use one of these older prints of these cards, they still are treated like the A-Spec. They still have the same text of the A-Spec. They still have the A-Spec rule. You're just using the older print of the card. Now, how do we get away with this? We have a provision for it. So this is the Tournament Rules Handbook. This is page 37. I'm going to read this again verbatim. Reprinted cards in the Unlimited format. As there is no restriction on the number of expansions legal for play in the Unlimited format, competitors will occasionally come across trainer cards from older expansions that have the same name as newer cards, but completely different effects. Competitors may still include those older versions of their card in their decks, provided the wording of the most recent version is used wherever that card is concerned. This provision allows us to use these older cards. Now, they used to be more specific. They used to specifically give an example of Computer Search being used in Unlimited in this way. They no longer specifically mention Computer Search, but this is that rule. Now, sometimes if you hear people talking about the Eternal format or Unlimited format, you might sometimes hear people refer to this as the auto errata rule or automatic errata. Obviously, I'm going to refer to it as that frequently. Basically, the idea behind this is new tournament legal copies of a trainer card by name automatically errata previous prints of the card. So if there is let's say in the future, they print a new version of Mount Lanakila, right? And they say that it has this new effect and that's what it has. And now instead of being a stadium card, it's for whatever reason a supporter card, then that's how the new version is played. And that's also how every other version of that card is played going forward. Even the stadium card that was printed, that now is no longer, and it's the new supporter version or whatever, right? And this actually has impacted some cards. So there was a trainer card in base set called Pokemon Center, and now that card is treated like a stadium card because it was printed as a stadium card much more recently, and it has a completely different effect. But that is how this rule automatically erratas and changes cards from the past. So this is why here we can use Computer Search and Master Ball from those very old sets in place of their newer cards. All right, next mechanic, Prism Star. I would say Prism Star Pokemon, but there aren't just Pokemon for Prism Star. Here we have a Pokemon, a supporter card, and a stadium card, All three of these are examples of Prism Star cards. Now, you might think, well, these are just yet another example of something like Radiant Pokemon, where you can only have one in your deck. Yes, but also no. Whereas with Radiant and Pokemon Star and Apex, you can only pick one of any from that mechanic, Prism Stars are a little bit different. Instead of picking just one, you can only have one copy of that card in your deck by name. Let's say, for example, this were Lunala Star. Of course, it didn't exist, but let's say, for example, it were, instead of Lunala Prism Star. In this case, Lunala Star would be our only Pokemon Star in the deck. We couldn't have any other Pokemon Star or Star cards in that case, right? However, Prism Star is different. If I have a copy of Lunala Prism Star in my deck, I can still have a copy of Lysander Prism Star. If I have a copy of Lysander Prism Star, I can still have a copy of Heat Factory Prism Star. I just can't have more than one of any of these cards by name. So one Lunala Prism Star, A-okay. Couldn't have a second one though, but I could still have a Lysander Prism Star. So that's how Prism Stars work. They work a little bit differently. They're one by name instead of one of any of that mechanic. Now, back to a mechanic very similar to Radiant Pokemon or Pokemon Star is the Shining mechanic. Now, this is like the very first iteration of that sort of mechanic. It says very clearly here, Shining Magikarp, you can't have more than one Shining Magikarp in your deck. Shining Mewtwo, you can't have more than one Shining Mewtwo in your deck. Shining Celebi, you can't have more than one Shining Celebi in your deck. So this is very much a early version of that sort of mechanic. Now, for the most part, this doesn't really matter that much. Most of these Shining cards are not especially good, and you probably won't be playing with them in your deck anyway, but it's worth it to know this particular rule as a just in case. There is one instance where this could matter. Now, it probably won't, but it's, again, something to be aware of. Shining Celebi exists in two different forms. So there is this Shining Celebi here from the Neo era and a Shining Celebi here from the Sun and Moon era. In this case here, if your deck contains the Shining Celebi from the Neo era, you cannot have a copy of the Shining Celebi from the Sun and Moon era in your deck, because the Neo era Shining Celebi specifically states that you cannot have more than one Shining Celebi in your deck. So you are now bound by the limitation on that particular card because you have included it in your deck. Now, if you do not have the Neo era Shining Celebi in your deck, then you're A-okay. You could have 4 copies of the Shining Celebi from the Sun and Moon promo set, and you're fine. But again, one more time, if you have Shining Celebi in your deck from the Neo era, you are then limited to exactly one copy of Shining Celebi in the deck, and that's the one from the Neo era that you put in there. You can no longer put the one from Sun and Moon in your deck. And very similar to that, we have what I refer to as the Unknown rule. So all of these Neo era Unknown have a rule printed on them that says you may have up to 4 basic Pokemon cards in your deck with Unknown in their name. Now, all of these Neo Unknown have that restriction printed on them. So you see the first 2 here on this slide are both Neo era Unknown. So they both have that restriction printed on them. That means that if you have any of these Neo era Unknown in your deck is now limited by that rule. Just like with Shining Celebi, the same applies for Unknown. So here, if I put Unknown E in my deck, this is Engage. If I put that card in my deck, now I can no longer have any more than 4 basic Pokemon in my deck that have Unknown in their name. So that means if I put Unknown E in my deck, I cannot then also put 4 Unknown V. Even the Unknown V from Silver Tempest, I can't do it because it is a basic Pokemon that has Unknown in the name. And I have been restricted by the Unknown rule because I have a Neo era Unknown in my deck. However, this does not apply if you have Unknown that do not have this rule printed on them. So here from the Diamond Pearl era, I have Unknown G or Guard that does not have the Unknown rule printed on it. And therefore, if I put Unknown Guard in my deck, I am not restricted by this Unknown rule because it is not printed on that card. And then this one is less of a limitation, more of just something to be aware of. There is an entire set of Arceus from Platinum Arceus and some related promo cards that have a very novel thing for the Pokemon trading card game on them. It says very specifically, you may have as many of this card in your deck as you like. So the rule of 4 for these guys simply does not apply. So if I wanted 57 copies of this grass type Arceus here on the left, I could do that. And then I could also put 2 Arceus level X and an Arceus, this water type one, or I can do 3 Arceus level X. It doesn't matter this all 3 of these in this example say specifically you can have as many of this card in your deck as you like, which means it completely overwrites the normal rule for how many you can have in your deck. All right, so now that we've covered the name and mechanic-based deck building restrictions, let's look at the format-imposed deck building restrictions. These I think are a little bit more simple. You kind of understand these intuitively, I think, or at least most of them. Up first, we have this one. This one literally comes out of Expanded. If you've played the Expanded format, you know this rule already. It's the same exact rule there. There's the discard draw 7 supporter limitation. So you cannot have Juniper, Sycamore, and Research in the same deck. You can't. You have to pick one and only one. So even if you only have 1 copy of Professor Juniper, you can now no longer have Sycamore or Research in your deck. You can't mix and match. You have to pick exactly one of these and only that one, and that's it. So again, 1 Professor Juniper means you cannot have Sycamore or Research. 1 Research means you cannot have Sycamore or Juniper. You have to pick one of the 3, and however many copies of the cards you have, they need to be all of those by the same name. Now, don't get too confused. Professor's Research has that flavor text on the right side, and the picture, of course, shows a specific professor. But as a card name, Professor's Research is simply Professor's Research. The specific professor on the card does not matter, so it doesn't matter for this rule at all. And another very familiar rule, if you're familiar with the Expanded format, is the so-called simple gusting limitation. So Lysander says switch in one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to the active spot. Boss's order is exactly the same rule. In both the Expanded and Unlimited formats, this is going to apply too. You are limited to exactly one or the other in your deck. Again, no matter how many you have in there, you have to pick one. So if you have a single copy of Lysander, you can no longer have Boss's orders, and just like with Boss's orders, you can't have Lysander. So it's just, that's the rule. That's how it works. Now, for the 2 rules that are eternal only, they do not apply to Expanded because they don't exist in Expanded, or they're not a big enough problem in Expanded. And they don't exist in Unlimited because TPCI does not care about Unlimited. The first one is the simpler one, Crushing Hammer limitation. So you can pick either Energy Removal 2 or Crushing Hammer for your deck. You can use one or the other. You cannot use both in your deck. Just like the other 2 limitations, you have to pick one or the other. No mixing and matching. If your deck has Energy Removal 2, you cannot have Crushing Hammer. Pick one or the other. So you can have up to 4 of one or the other. And then the last limitation, this one goes by a lot of different names. Here I've called it the prizeless substitute rule. You might know it as the doll rule, or the prizeless fossil rule, the fossil rule, the robo substitute rule. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same kind of thing either way. Basically, there are 6 different kinds of cards currently. They're all substitute Pokemon in some way, shape, or form. And when they are knocked out, they do not give up prize cards. In the Eternal format, you are restricted in this respect that these 6 cards, you can use up to 4 in any combination of them. So you could have 2 Robo Substitute, 2 Lily's Pokédoll, 2 Mysterious Fossil, a Robo Substitute, and a Lily's Pokédoll. Again, you can mix and match on these guys, but you are limited to 4 in total of any of these 6 cards. And that's just to make sure that the control decks are kept a little bit at bay, because otherwise these get very ridiculous very quickly. But again, the prizeless substitute limitation does exist, and it's something to be aware of. Not too hard to understand once you know the 6 cards here. They are listed, of course, on the website itself. Now, all of these different limitations can be a little confusing. I'm going to leave a link to a video about my Excel deck builder. If you are somebody who regularly builds decks for the Eternal format, you may find that my Excel-based deck builder is a very useful tool for you. It is a Patreon exclusive perk, so you do have to be a paid subscriber for Patreon to get it, but I regularly update it on the Patreon channel on my Discord. Basically, it is a deck builder that automatically checks all these things for you, so don't be concerned if you have that. It's going to check all those limitations for you and make sure that you have a legal Eternal format deck so that you can play to your heart's content. Anyway, I do hope things are a little bit clearer now. Again, look for that video on the Excel-based deck builder in the description of this video. But that is it for today. Hopefully you understand the limitations a little bit better now. I will see you guys in the next video.